IE4 looked good when it came out as compared to IE3. Now, anyone who's been doing web design or knows anything about CSS knows how long we cursed this browser. But at the time, it was so much better than IE3. In fact, it's amazing to me when I look back at some of my old files regarding CSS support in IE3, it's amazing to me that anyone ever bothered to try CSS stuff. There's just so little that's supported. I mean, even if you're charitable, it's like a 13% support of CSS1. So, but Netscape 4 came out, and it had its quirk, like thinking that there's space between a border and the padding of an element. I don't know. And other kinds of weird stuff. But this meant that there was now a need to actually start support in in more than one browser. So you would have Netscape 4, IE3, IE4. I think it's the IE4, at least here in the beginning, fares pretty well as compared to IE3 or even Netscape 4. So this was 1997 we've gotten up to. This is also fun. If you look closely, I know you can't read this out there, but you can at least see the colors. This column is IE4 for Windows, and this column is IE4 for the Mac. Now you'll notice that they're inconsistent with each other because the two have never been the same code base. But not only have they never been the same code base, but at least at this stage, the two teams didn't really talk to each other. So the link element was supported, yes, here in IE4 for Windows, but not IE4 for the Mac. And, well, it has a bug in IE4 for the Mac. And then add import, supported in IE4 for Windows, not in IE4 for the Mac. I mean, just stuff like that was, quite properly driving authors up a wall. Anyone here try using CSS during this time frame? Anyone? Okay, guess not. So, I'm trying to think of a good analog. Unfortunately, I can't. Something like, suppose there were two major Python interpreters that people used, and they were wildly inconsistent about what they did when you actually ran your Python program. No one should put up with that. And to a certain extent, the only reason we did is that, there was really not any other choice. It's not like, well, if there were that situation with Python, then people would just not use Python, right? They'd be like, look, I can't deal with the inconsistency. I'm going to use a language that actually works. Well, we didn't exactly have another web that we could all go to that was more consistent. So this is what we were stuck with. Here's what changed things. The Web Standards Project. Because it was right around that same time, the 1997-98 timeframe, when a number of people, not these people exactly, but Jeffrey Zeldman, Glenn Davis, and a few others who were web designers at the time were sort of reacting to this inconsistency between browsers. The analogy they used at the time was if television programs had to be developed differently for different TVs, then television never would have gotten anywhere. This is crazy that we're spending all of our time, well, half of our time developing sites and then half of our time redeveloping the site for another browser than the one we developed in. What we really need here is we need standards. We need some consistency. I mean, that only makes sense, right? Of course, at the time, everyone said that it wasn't going to happen and it couldn't be done, and browsers would never be consistent, and these guys were just wasting their time and making a lot of noise, self-promoting, and blah, 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 whatever. They formed the Web Standards Project and formed some action committees. One of them is the CSS Action Committee, which dubbed itself the CSS Samurai, because when it started out, there were 7. Yes, I know there are 10 names on this list. A few got added, but when it started out, there were 7 members of the CSS Action Committee. So far as I know, this is the only action committee that ever actually did anything at the WASP. If the others did, they never told anyone else about it. basically, I think there were two key things that happened in order for the WASP to succeed. Well, okay, 2.5. The first one is kind of a combined strategy. It was, okay, so Jeffrey Zeldman and Glenn Davis and a couple of other guys were on a mailing list and said there ought to be like a web standards group. Okay, but nobody knew who these guys were. Jeffrey Zeldman was not a known name at the time, for example. He had some recognition in the design community, but not, for example, in the web design community. Similarly with Glenn Davis, he wasn't really known as a programmer guy. Right? Project cool, sure, but so what they did is they got people like Tim Bray to be on their steering committee. Tim Bray, who basically Mr. XML. Jeffrey Veen, who had written the Hotwired Style Guide and actually was a fairly well-known name in terms of the web. So they got people like that on their steering committee, and then they basically roadblocked the web. In television advertising, back in the days when there were only 3 networks, what advertisers would do sometimes is they would purchase roadblocks. They would run the same ad on all 3 networks at the same time. So no matter what channel you were on, you were going to get the ad. That was what they called a roadblock. So that might be the ad right before the 6 o'clock news, or right after the 6 o'clock or whatever. So they basically did the same thing. They got enough people involved that when the Web Standards Project launched, you could not go to a web development community or mailing list basically without hearing about it. They got on CNET and on all kinds of stuff. So that was number one. And the reason that I put those together is because the steering committee members helped make that happen. When Jeff Bean was talking about, this, Tim Bray mentioned it, and Glenn Davis put it on Project Cool, and Jeffrey Zeldman put it on his website, and Wired covered it, and so on and so on. They made a big, big splash. The other thing was what the CSS working group did, or CSS, action committee. We did a number of things behind the scenes, but this is what we did that actually made a difference. Standards compliance reviews. The first of which was Microsoft Windows Internet Explorer's top 10 CSS problems. Okay. So rather than trying to produce this exhaustive document of everything they had done wrong, or everything that they hadn't implemented that needed to be implemented, and we just said, okay, these are the top 10 things that we're facing. These are the top 10 things that if they were fixed would make life much better. So then we did the same thing with Opera, and the same thing again with Macintosh Internet Explorer. Said, okay, we've looked at it, and this fundamental problem causes all these other problems, so fixing it would be in its best interest. It's interesting to look at this because this text down here says, no, we do not plan on reviewing any Netscape browsers until Communicator 5.0 begins to approach its final form. Of course, there never was a Communicator 5.0. They went straight to 6. And we never really touched Netscape 4 or 4.5 because at the time, Netscape was saying, well, we're going to come out with 5.0 and it's going to be better. And we were like, well, okay, they know what's broken in 4. We couldn't even produce a top 10. It would have to be a top 20 at a minimum. Okay, so, and as it says, of about 40 pages in our first 2 reviews, that was the test pages that we created for the Windows Internet Explorer and Opera CSS problems. Of 40 test pages, there are only 2 that don't demonstrate bugs in Netscape Communicator, and we weren't even looking for bugs when we wrote those tests in Netscape Communicator. So, it was one of those, look, we're not going to waste anyone's time with that one. So, but the reason why I think these were important is that what they did was they basically said to browser manufacturers, look, we understand that you can't fix everything. So given that you can only fix something, please fix these, right? This is what's making these are the things that are making developers' lives the most hellish. You know, support charts, those are nice too. Because the other thing about having a support chart like the CSS browser support chart that I showed a few slides ago is that it's sort of an impartial public shaming. You're basically saying, okay, here's what these browsers do, and here's what they don't do. And here's what they do wrong. Here's what they try to do, but they get wrong, so you need to watch out for that even more. And, you know, rather than being a, this is why I hate Microsoft Internet Explorer, or this is why Opera sucks, or whatever, it was, this is what these guys are doing. And if it's not as nice as we would like it to be, that's not, you know, our fault. There were a couple of times where actually people on the IE team called me to say, hey, about your support chart. And I would go, yeah. And they would say, could you be harder on us, please? Because we need to convince management that this is, you know, that we need to do something here. This is where I really started to learn that in any organization, Microsoft being no exception, usually the people in the trenches want to do the right thing. It's the people above them that are the problem. And it's not that the people above them are inherently evil necessarily, although, you know, maybe they are. You know, I can't speak to their personal lives, but they have very different priorities. A manager does not care, you know, whether it's at Microsoft or Netscape of the time, whatever. The manager doesn't care about following industry standards, except to the extent that it affects the bottom line effect. You know. So the higher ups at Microsoft didn't, you know, if the engineers were to go to them and say, hey, our CSS support's kind of bad, we need to improve it, yeah, they don't care, right? The only thing they care about is, do we look better than our competitors? And therefore, are we going to, you know, be more successful than our competitors? And so to have a support chart that says, okay, here you go. Here are all these browsers that claim to support CSS. Here's how well or ill they do. And when you break them down to percentages, you know, this browser's on top and these browsers are behind in this order. And if the guys at, you know, the Microsoft managers can be shown that list that says, we're in 4th place, and, you know, that's our best showing, that will get results. That's something that you can use on management. The engineers typically don't need to be convinced. They would rather, you know, all things being equal, produce a product that does everything it tries to do perfectly, because that means they've done a good job, right? I mean, that's what I like to do when I do jobs. I like to have it come out exactly the way it should and not have any bugs or other problems. So, of course, without a test suite of some fashion or another, the support charts couldn't have been created. Without test pages, which you can think of as a test suite, we couldn't have written these top 10s. Okay, so I think what that taught me is that in any developing technology, test suites they're critical. You can't get anywhere without them, really. Or you can't get anywhere useful without them. So anyway, moving forward. IE5 came out. Salvation! Or not. It was better than Netscape 4. But again, it only looked good by comparison. If we look back now, there's a whole raft of things that were just so bad about IE5. For example, it basically didn't support the styling of inline elements. You couldn't apply padding or borders or any of that stuff to inline elements. So hyperlinks, for example, you couldn't really style. And images, you could only sort of style. And, you know, that doesn't even get into the various bugs and such that were in IE5. It was better, but still not all that great. Now, you know, remember, we're up to 1999 here.